Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I cannot wait to introduce our guest today. Before I do, I want to thank some people that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com. Brassandwinds.com are where we at the Willow School go when we're looking for brass or woodwind instruments for our students. They're fantastic people, and we think you should give them a try. You're watching Truer MU, my journey through the truth about music. I hope you are learning something each time you watch one of these interviews. And if you like them, please like them. And please, we need all the subscribers we can get. I'd like to introduce our guest to you today, but before I do, there's usually a story. And in this case, this is someone I have had the pleasure of knowing casually for a number of years and admired her work as well. As I grew my children, I grew them on her work. This is Laurel Snyder, and she is a wonderful author. Let me tell you a little about her. Laurel Snyder is an American poet and writer of children's books, including novels and picture books. She's also edited a number of literary journals and is a commentator for NPR's All Things Considered. And we do have authors on this show, but in this case, there's a special reason we have an author on our show. Laurel, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, we're happy to have you too. Thank you. Before we talk about the reason we brought you on The Truth About Music, I want to know what the first book you ever read is.
First book I ever read? Gosh, that's really, really hard. My parents read to me a ton, and then the sort of books that they read to me became books that I read. And so there's a sort of blurry space there. A very, very important early book for me was a book called Mr. Dog by Margaret Wise Brown, which is a little golden book with pictures by Garth Williams. And it's still one of my favorite picture books.
Tell me why. Why is it important to you?
I think that there is something. Margaret Wise Brown, people probably know her for Goodnight Moon.
Yeah.
More than anything else. But she wrote, she's just a fascinating story, and you can read her letters, and there's a wonderful autobiography of her called there are two. There's one called The Great Green Room, and then there's one called Awakened by the Moon. But she was just a really eccentric, interesting historical figure. And one of the things that I love best about her is that Mr. Dog in particular sort of follows this odd logic of there's a boy. The idea is that there's this dog and there's this boy who belongs to himself. And it really just kind of follows their sort of day together. But there's like a maybe the sentence that explains it best is there's a section of the thing where it says like, Mr. Dog was a conservative. He liked things in their place. He was a funny old dog. He liked strawberries. And there's something about like the non sequiturs of that you're not trying to kind of, there's no agenda to it. These are just fully characters living their lives and sort of wandering through their own story. And I think sometimes children's books today, picture books today, they're just so formatted. She was really at the very beginning of what like we call the golden age of picture books.
Yeah.
And there weren't any rules for her yet. She also like operated as like the editor of Gertrude Stein's children's books. She was just a really outside the box thinker.
So. Yeah. What a great seed to plant in your head there as a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what is the first thing you remember writing?
Oh, I have. Well, I'm sure I wrote other things before this, but I have scribbled in the back of a book. There's an old paperback copy of a book called Bells on Their Toes, which is the sequel to a book called Cheaper by the Dozen that people may remember the movie. And it's scribbled in the back of that somewhere on my. I'm embarrassed you guys are seeing my stacks of shelves. We periodically have to call the books in the house, and then I go around to little free libraries in the neighborhood and stick things in the little free library because I get a lot of free books.
Yeah.
So that's the current stack of books that need to go to the little free libraries. But
first thing you remember writing?
Yeah, sorry. First thing I remember writing was this book that's somewhere on one of my shelves has a poem in the back of it that's called "Have You Seen the Fairies?" And it's a very, very sort of traditional rhymed couplets about
do
asking.
You have it memorized?
Yes, I do actually. Do you want to hear it?
Recite it, please.
This is embarrassing. It goes, "Have you seen the fairies there? Robes of silken colors soft, jewels and metals sparkling bright, tinted silver wings aloft." And then a voice responds to that and says, "Yes, I've seen the fairies, but only in my dreams. Save once I thought I saw them, but ah, what can it mean? I've now grown old and weary, but memories shall live on, meaning sometimes more to me than the rising dawn." And of course, I wrote this when I was like 10 years old. So I was now
Wow.
old and weary.
Gosh. No, I'm actually very impressed. That's for a 10-year-old. That's a precocious poem.
Yeah, that's always been the thing that came easiest to me. I can sort of speak in iambic pentameter, and I think my parents read me a lot of poetry when I was a kid, and I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time reading when I was a kid. And my best friend and I would get together and try to write books and like go outside and run around and play games and then come inside and like scribble them down.
Yeah.
So we did a bit of that probably before I wrote this one poem, but
Yeah. I was
so
inspired by a book called Hailstones and Halibut Bones, and my first poem sounded a lot like that poem.
yeah, no, I mean, I think, right, we got an idea in our heads as kids that this is what a poem is.
Right, right.
And then later you learn that poems can do all sorts of other things, but
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you to tell a story. I caught it in one of your interviews, and this is a pretty poignant story. So if it's too much, you can say no, thank you. But I want you to tell the story about when the child in the audience asked you about your
oh,
beginning of writing. Can you tell that story?
the one where the kid asked me how to tell when.
Yeah, they said, well, you told them that you started writing when you were 8, and the child wanted to
Mhm.
know what
Yeah.
spurred you.
So, I mean, and again, story, we tell our own stories and they become mythology. And then we tell those stories again and again and again. And I actually have a graphic memoir coming out in a couple of years with a wonderful, wonderful illustrator named um, Trung Lai Nguyen, uh, called Fairy Hunter, that really grew out of doing school visits and talking to kids about it and telling the story, which has now become a mythology. So I feel like I just need to say, like, it's sometimes hard to parse out. The book is called Fairy Hunter: The Truth and Other Stories, which I think the subtitle is important. Like, it's hard to know what's, I don't remember every detail of every moment from childhood, clearly, obviously. But the way that I understand it is my parents got divorced. And I think this is what you're
Yes.
referring to. My parents got divorced when I was 8, and uh, it was a very difficult, difficult divorce, and I was very alone. And it's a specific trait. I think I'm an extrovert and I'm an external processor. And when you are those things and you are also kind of a social pariah, it's particularly hard, right? Like I mean, it's always hard to be lonely, but it's really hard to be lonely if you're not capable of kind of figuring out what you think about things. And so I think for me, in a lot of ways, what happened is I was lonely. And so then I spent all this time at the library by myself and reading, because when I was reading, I wasn't in my sad life. I was in Narnia or wherever, wherever the book took me. And so books became really my salvation and my friends. um and so, I mean, that was wonderful in and of itself, but at some point the stories run out. You have 10 books from the library, eventually you run out of something to read. And I think that was really what happened, is that sort of I turned to the blank page in the absence of someone to talk to, because the page can't leave, right? The page is always there.
Yeah.
And it is the constant in my life. It is the thing that kind of keeps me company. Wherever I go, I always have a little notebook in my pocket. And now sometimes I use my phone if I wake up in the middle of the night. I send myself a text if I've got my phone in my room. But just that feeling of knowing that sort of I can work it out in my head with the paper, and knowing that sort of someone is listening. So that was
Eh,
where it started.
Does it still serve you in that same way?
It's an interesting question, because I've also been telling people lately, I feel like if I had not in a good way, but I feel like I probably never would have written a novel if I'd had Facebook. That we are never alone any longer. We always have these amazing supercomputers in our pockets. And that means we're never alone, which is awesome when you or reaching out in a moment of crisis or talking to an old friend when you really want to hear their voice. But it's not awesome when you spend 3 hours you wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep. And so you spend 3 hours scrolling Facebook and leaving random comments for people you barely know. And sometimes those moments are great. Sometimes the internet has provided me with really deep and lasting and real friendships, but I don't know that it operates the same way in my life any longer. And that's something I'm trying to grapple with right now, that I periodically take like a break from the internet, to see if I can kind of reset myself, but then I always come back to it. And with certain world events that are going on right now, the news is so hard to handle that I actually have been feeling like it might be a relief to just completely disconnect from it and, go back to my notebook. So.
Yeah. Well, if you'll pardon the pun, you wouldn't be alone in that, I think.
It's true.
Right. So one of the reasons, like I said, I have authors on the show sometimes, and it isn't necessarily because they're musicians, but because there's things that relate to music through their writing. But you have written a children's book about Bruce Springsteen.
I have.
Now,
I've actually written other children's books that have Springsteen in them too.
Oh, really?
He's a theme in my life in a lot of ways.
Okay,
But
well,
yes, I have written a little golden book about Bruce Springsteen. Yes.
Now that is really exciting. Okay, you've almost answered this question, but how big a Bruce fan are you? I'm
a really big Bruce fan. And I'm a fan in general. Like I'm not ashamed of my fandom. There's almost like a religious quality, not like I worship Bruce Springsteen, but for me, there's almost a religious quality to the fan relationship. That there's something ecstatic for me about concerts and performance and live music. And there is something, I like the experience of loving something completely and having that be a sort of one-way relationship. The internet has changed that in weird ways. So like now I follow people online that I'm fans of, and sometimes they follow me back. And that's really strange. We end up interacting. And somebody said to me when this book came out, they said, maybe you'll get to meet him. And I was like, oh God, I can't, that would be way too much.
Oh, that's not what you want?
No, I like it. He's not a human to me. Like he belongs on the stage and I belong dancing in the pit, like that's the relationship. And I like that. I feel comfortable with that. And I don't want that. I don't want his grandeur in my life shattered. Like, I mean, I know he's also a human being, but I've read his autobiography and I know his struggles and all that kind of stuff. But I like I said before, I like mythology. Like I like the idea of letting him be the creation he has made. That is what he wants people to know about him. I like having that. And that doesn't mean I don't like I've gone to Asbury Park multiple times and driven past his childhood home and seen concerts at the Stone Pony. Like, it's not like I don't want to pursue the things I love in my life, but I don't want to end that illusion the way that it is.
Do you know whether he's read the book?
Oh, I doubt it. I can't. I mean, I don't know. I can't imagine. I would love to know that he had. That would make me really happy.
Okay. Bruce, if you're watching.
Yeah. And I'm sort of shameless in like I've tried to score concert tickets like by harassing his management on Twitter and stuff like that. It's not like I'm like above it.
Right.
I like him being what he is. And I love music, and my husband's a musician. My younger son is downstairs. I had to go downstairs and be like, no electric until I'm done with this podcast recording. My house is full of music. I was actually just noticing that my sad little ukulele has snapped its neck on the wall over there. And I was like, oh gosh, like talking about music while there's a broken instrument in the room feels wrong.
Wow.
But music is in our lives. Music is my husband's at band practice right now. A deep part of our lives. And I was just at the Ryman last week. We pursue music in our, like, that's how we travel. That's how we spend our money.
Right. So a lifetime of loving music, a lifetime of loving Bruce, and a lifetime of writing books. And yet it's taken you this long to do this. What was the impetus that got you to do this?
You know what happened? A friend of mine did the Dolly Parton book. Little Golden Books has this biography series, and a friend of mine did the Little Golden Book for Dolly Parton. And I saw it on her, like she had announced it on social media. I wrote to her and said, "Oh my gosh, like, how did you get that gig?" Because immediately when I saw it, I was like, I could do Bruce. And I like went and looked it up and realized they hadn't done one. And she wrote back and said, "It's not like, do you just pitch it like anything else? Like, because it's not these kinds of books. It's not like an authorized autobiography or something, or
Right.
authorized biography or something like they have one about like Dr. Fauci, and they have one about like Henry VIII, and like whatever. I don't even know if they do have Henry VIII, but and so like I sent an email to my agent and said, I'd really like to do this. And it's not a big paying job. And she wrote back and was like, "Are you sure it's like a flat fee? And it's not that much money." And I was like, no, no, no. I just want to have my name and his name on the cover together. Really
Yeah.
all I want. And so that's how that happened. But I will say, I wrote a book years ago called Bigger Than a Bread Box that's actually set in our shared neighborhood. That's very much about my parents. It's based in my parents' divorce. It's based in my sort of memories from upper elementary and middle school. And that book is sort of wrapped around the song Hungry Heart, which is like sort of it's laced into the book.
Hmm.
And then this graphic novel that I have coming out in 2 years also has Hungry Heart in it. So it took me this long to try to write a picture book biography about him, but I've written about him before. And like I have a poem that was published in a magazine. I think it was publishing Black Clock, called Dear Bruce Springsteen. And I've written about him online. Like if you go online, I wrote an essay called On Being a Serious Fan that's sort of about my ecstatic relationship with going to see my first Bruce Springsteen concert.
Yeah.
So this is something I have been circling in different ways for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into that a little bit. As I've learned more about you in detail preparing for this interview, I have found there's some interesting parallels between your work and Bruce's work.
Really?
Publishers Weekly talks says that you address some very difficult themes and topics: death, homelessness, trust, and abuse in your work. And anyone who reads your work knows that. Bruce does too.
Mhm.
This is not a coincidence. Is there some appeal to his music because of that?
For me, I
Sure.
mean,
Does that attract you, those themes?
I definitely feel like I definitely feel like as I have, well, it's something that's I mean, I've always written about those kinds of things in my work for adults. In terms of writing for children, it's something that I came to sort of uh, through the process of writing books that weren't like that, and realizing that I needed to trust kids more, and that particularly for upper elementary, I felt increasingly like, uh, we have a lot of books for lower elementary. We have a lot of books that are sort of fun middle grade. And then there's sort of YA. And at the time I was feeling, this is less true now than it was, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but I was feeling like the upper elementary piece was missing, that there weren't a lot of books about actual 12-year-olds, let's say.
Yeah.
And the way that the books about 12-year-olds are ostensibly about 12-year-olds, but they're really about 8-year-olds. And I noticed this, the part of where this started was that I wrote a book called 7 Stories Up. Um, and I got a really angry letter from a mom who was mad at me for spoiling the Tooth Fairy. But the main character was in 8th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, middle school. And I found myself thinking, what, am I not allowed to spoil the Tooth Fairy for a middle school student? Like, that's crazy. And then I realized, like, no, her daughter was 7. We're designing books that are appropriate. They want to, this is capitalism. They want to catch as large a readership as possible. And so they're going to stretch the book's ages as far as they can. And that had resulted in a lot of middle grade books that are sort of theoretically about kids that in middle school that are really designed to be appropriate for a 7 or 8-year-old reader. Anyway, and I think the more I thought about it that way and thought about, like, well, what is 7th grade? Who are you in 7th grade? What can you understand? How are you processing the world? What do you know? The more I wanted to try to write about the harder things in life, because I mean, you and I both know, like, kids go through stuff
Yeah.
and they understand it and they process it and they talk about it. And we as parents don't want them to, like, we don't want them to have to deal with those things, but they do.
Right.
Um,
And here's Bruce Springsteen, writing to teenagers, and his music is not, I'm going to love you till I die. It's more like I'm going to love you then I die.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And maybe I don't love you. I mean, like there's
Right.
just,
Not anymore. Right.
yeah. No, I mean, he's just so embedded in my childhood, and he's actually very much embedded in my parents' divorce in my head. Like
Yeah.
this is sort of where it comes into the graphic memoir. Like he was vinyl in spinning in my house of sort of origin, and then and my dad, there were just similarities. There were sort of that's why the song Hungry Heart specifically. And I grew
Mm.
up in Baltimore, so got a wife and kids in Baltimore, Jack. Like it just sort of the seeds were planted there.
Yeah.
Um, but also, the I think about like later stuff like Ghost of Tom Joad, or like that he's interested in telling an American story in ways that are, I think, really honest, or try to be honest,
Hmm.
about harder things. He's political in ways that rock and roll wasn't always political back then, although now it is more so. And I'm very much a political person who grew up in a very political home. But also he's from, my part of the country. Like his landscapes are my landscapes, his beaches or his boardwalks are my boardwalks, his highways are my highways. Yeah, it's a deep, deep love. It's a deep love.
Yeah.
And something else funny my sister and I were just talking about this recently. Something else funny that happened is, like, he was in my childhood in one way. And then, then you turn 16 and all your friends are listening to Susie and the Banshees or whatever, and you get into the things you get into, and then you start following. Like for me, it was like I got into like hardcore and sort of what we'd now call goth or emo, but was then alternative. And then I started following that. Did a couple of years of getting really into the Dead, as many of us did, and somewhere in that Bruce got lost. And then I went to college, and my sister was 6 years younger than me, so she would have been a little kid in those years, and she fell in love with him, like at like you know yeah, like in her like early teens or so. She fell in love with him when I was in college, and kind of brought him back into the family. And I think now I'm probably making up a memory, but she like sort of got like that. She has a sort of mystical story. I wish you were here to tell it, about going into a record store, or like record and tape traders kind of place. And they had one of those like sound machines, like a Sam Goody, where you can like listen to a couple of tracks, that are highlighted. And his greatest hits had just come out, which is one of the, I know, like if you're a real fan, you're not supposed to listen to greatest hits, but it's one of the all-time greatest hits records.
Yeah. It's a good album.
They really are just, and the sequence is fantastic, and
Yeah.
the sort of chronology of it. And she like listened to it there in the record store that day, and it like was a transformative moment for her, which she didn't remember the childhood memories. Like she was 6 years younger, so when I was 8, my parents split up, she was 2. She didn't remember the memories that I had of our family relationship with Bruce Springsteen. She was discovering it as a young teenager,
Mm.
and fell in love with it, and bought that CD. And that sort of, it like re-entered our family life, where I'd go home for holidays and we'd all be dancing around the living room to Thunder Road or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and so then Bruce kind of re-entered my life as I was leaving college and heading off to grad school.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you've already established that he was an influence on you from early on. In your interview with Writer's Digest, you mentioned back when I started writing for kids, the genres blended together a lot. Prose poems would become picture books, and stories would turn into poems. Most of them messy and unacceptable to everyone. That is also very typical of Bruce's early work. It's messy in that way. It's hard to define the genre. He didn't get so click, click, click until later.
yeah.
Do you see that as an influence?
And I don't know if he is click, click, click now. Like I think we understand him a certain way. But if you go and listen from record to record, um, I think that there's a huge range in his work, actually. Like he's always recognizably himself,
Yes.
but he's had different incarnations. And like I went and saw him a few years ago on Broadway, and like it's just a different, like he remakes himself periodically. There was the Seeger sessions, and the like he's got all these different identities.
Hmm.
I don't think Bruce like influenced me in any way, that like I think I am a messy person. Like as you can see, I am a messy person, and I'm turning 50 this year, and I have come to terms with the fact that I'm never. It's just orderly is never going to be who I am,
Uh-huh.
and I also feel like genre and genre and form are both things that are constructed because they help us organize the world. Like it's easier. Like this is what a novel is like, and it gets more and more the what it is. It sort of reduces and calcifies and like, but I think about this a lot in terms of new forms that are coming up in children's literature. When we look at verse novels or we look at graphic novels, they're allowed to do things that we don't allow regular novels to do, because I think they haven't gotten set in place yet
Yeah.
as forms. So we demand a kind of narrative arc from a regular novel, but a graphic novel can be a series of linked stories. It can be a sort of stream of consciousness. Certainly the same is true for a verse novel. There's all sorts of hybrid stuff happening now where you'll see sort of graphic novel sections, or parts are verse and parts are prose, weaving different stories together, stuff like that. So, I mean, on some level, I push back on the idea that there is any inherent necessity to those forms, and that sort of we train people how to read things and they come to expect those things. So if you see enough Marvel movies, it's very, very hard to go watch something from 50 years ago because it's not exciting the way you think it should be exciting, because your brain, you've like carved neural pathways for how to watch a movie, basically. But we're not inherently that way. And when you write for children, certainly they're not as formed in that way. So the younger the book, in some ways, I feel like the younger the book, the more open it is. You can kind of do anything for a 4-year-old because they haven't been taught yet what they're supposed to find in a book. By the time they're 12 or 16 or whatever, they have more of those expectations.
Yeah. And maybe also at that age, they're looking for boundaries and it's helpful.
Maybe. I mean, they would tell you they're not, right? Like the 16-year-old would tell you
That's a
they're
lie. It's a lie.
never bound. Yeah, but I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
They're figuring out the rules of the world.
Yeah. They don't have boundaries, so they ask you to set them for them. That's my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I remember having a conversation at Morelli's, the ice cream in the neighborhood, once with my kid, and he said to me, I said, "What ice cream do you want?" He said, "Can you just choose for me?"
That's a great example.
It's like too much, and they deal with so much more choice than we did. The world is just so much more than it was.
Yeah. Right. It's much more available.
Yeah.